There comes a moment in many relationships when silence becomes louder than words. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that echoes with realization. It's the moment when someone finally understands the value of what they once overlooked, and often that realization comes too late. Many men spend years showing up in quiet ways, not with grand speeches, not with dramatic gestures, but with consistency. They answer the phone when no one else does. They stand beside someone when life becomes chaotic. They listen when the world feels overwhelming. They give their time, their patience, their loyalty. Yet strangely, these are the very things that often go unnoticed. Why? Because consistency is quiet, loyalty is calm. Stability is not dramatic. And human psychology has a strange habit of ignoring what feels secure. At the beginning, attention feels exciting. The effort is new. The connection feels like electricity, but over time, familiarity replaces excitement. What once felt special starts to feel ordinary. The man who stayed becomes predictable. The man who cared becomes expected, and the effort that once felt meaningful slowly becomes invisible. This is where the mistake begins. When someone always shows up, it becomes easy to assume they always will. When someone always forgives, it becomes easy to believe they always should. When someone always understands, it becomes easy to stop appreciating the depth of that understanding. But people are not permanent guarantees. Even the most patient man has limits. Even the most loyal heart can grow tired. Even the strongest love can slowly fade when it feels unseen. And here is the turning point that many people don't expect. The moment a man stops trying to prove his value, people start to see it. When he becomes quiet, when he stops chasing validation, when he no longer fights to be understood, when he begins focusing on his own growth, his own peace, his own direction, suddenly the absence becomes noticeable. The texts that used to arrive every morning stop appearing. The reassuring presence is no longer there. The emotional safety that once felt normal is gone. And in that silence, realization begins. It becomes clear that the man who seemed ordinary was actually rare. The patience that once felt boring was actually strength. The loyalty that seemed predictable was actually commitment. But by the time this awareness arrives, something inside that man may have already changed. Because when someone spends too long feeling undervalued, they eventually learn a powerful lesson. They deserve to be where they are appreciated. And once a person reaches that level of self-respect, they stop returning to places where their presence was once taken for granted. This is the reality many people struggle to accept. Appreciation delayed often becomes appreciation denied. The painful truth is that love does not disappear overnight. It fades slowly when effort meets indifference. It weakens when loyalty is treated like obligation instead of a choice. But when someone finally understands their worth, they begin to protect their energy. They stop begging to be valued. They stop convincing others of their importance. They simply walk away from spaces that cannot recognize it. And that is when realization hits the hardest, not when someone is present, but when they are gone. Because absence has a strange way of revealing what presence quietly carried all along. The respect, the stability, the emotional strength, the quiet sacrifices no one noticed at the time. By the time someone finally sees that value clearly, they often face a difficult truth. Some lessons arrive only after the opportunity has passed. And the most powerful realization in human psychology is this: the people who treat you as replaceable often discover too late that you were not easy to replace at all. One of the most misunderstood truths in human relationships is how easily consistency becomes invisible. When a man shows up every day with loyalty, patience, and stability, those qualities often stop looking special to the person receiving them. They begin to look normal, predictable, even ordinary. But what many people fail to realize is that consistency is one of the rarest forms of commitment a person can offer. In the early stages of a connection, excitement usually comes from uncertainty. The attention feels new, the effort feels thrilling, and every message or moment together carries emotional weight. But as time passes and someone continues to show up with the same level of care, the human mind begins to adjust. What once felt extraordinary slowly becomes expected. This is where perception quietly shifts. The man who listens patiently during difficult moments is no longer seen as emotionally strong. He simply becomes the person who always listens. The man who remains loyal and supportive is no longer admired for his dedication. He becomes the person who should be there. His effort slowly loses its spotlight, not because it has less value, but because it has become familiar. Familiarity can be dangerous when appreciation disappears. Psychologically, people are often drawn to what feels uncertain or difficult to obtain. The things that require effort to keep often seem more exciting. But the person who offers stability can unintentionally be overlooked because their presence feels secure. There is no fear of losing them. There is no urgency to value them. And that comfort can slowly transform appreciation into assumption. Yet the truth is that consistency requires strength. It takes emotional discipline to stay calm when situations become complicated. It takes maturity to remain loyal when distractions appear. It takes character to continue caring even when recognition is minimal. These qualities do not appear overnight, and they are not easy to maintain. A man who consistently stands by someone is quietly investing time, energy, and emotional dedication into that connection, but because he does it repeatedly, the effort becomes silent. It blends into the background of everyday life. Many people do not recognize the weight of that commitment until it disappears. When the person who once showed endless patience begins to pull away, the absence creates clarity. Suddenly, the calm voice that offered reassurance is no longer there. The dependable presence that once provided stability becomes a memory. The effort that once seemed ordinary reveals how much it actually mattered. That is when realization begins to grow. People start remembering the moments they ignored, the support they assumed would always exist, the quiet sacrifices that were never loudly announced but were constantly present. Consistency was never ordinary. It only appeared ordinary because it was always there. And when something valuable is always present, the human mind often stops noticing its importance. But once it disappears, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. The loyalty that seemed predictable was actually rare. The patience that seemed routine was actually strength. And the man who quietly showed up every day was offering something far more meaningful than excitement. He was offering reliability, emotional safety, and genuine commitment. The painful irony of human nature is that people often recognize the value of consistency only after they experience life without it. One of the most revealing patterns in human behavior is that people often recognize value only when they feel the possibility of losing it. Constantly supportive, and constantly willing to invest their time and attention, the mind slowly becomes comfortable with that presence. It stops questioning it. It stops appreciating it with the same intensity. What was once meaningful begins to feel guaranteed. But nothing in human relationships is guaranteed. When a man consistently proves his loyalty, his care, and his willingness to show up, he can unintentionally create a sense of emotional security for the other person. That security is powerful, but it can also lead to a subtle psychological shift. Instead of seeing his effort as something valuable, it begins to feel like something permanent. Something that will always be there no matter what. This is where appreciation quietly begins to fade. The human mind is wired to react strongly to uncertainty. When something feels stable and predictable, the urgency to protect it weakens. People start assuming the person will stay, forgive, and continue giving the same level of effort. Over time, this assumption slowly replaces gratitude. However, everything changes the moment the dynamic shifts. When a man stops trying to constantly prove his value, something deep happens. Instead of chasing attention or approval, he begins focusing on himself. His energy moves toward personal growth, his peace of mind, and his own direction in life. He stops explaining himself to people who don't understand him. He stops forcing conversations where his voice feels ignored. He stops trying to convince others that his presence matters, and suddenly, the silence becomes noticeable. The messages that used to arrive is no longer offered so freely. The reassuring presence that once filled the space begins to disappear. This absence creates something powerful. Awareness. When someone who once gave so much attention begins to withdraw it, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The mind starts comparing the present moment with the past. The comfort that once existed now feels distant. The stability that once surrounded the relationship now feels uncertain. That uncertainty triggers realization. The same effort that once seemed ordinary now appears meaningful. The patience that once felt predictable now feels valuable. The emotional support that once felt routine now feels irreplaceable. This is the moment when many people finally see what was there all along. That this realization rarely happens while someone is still chasing approval. It happens when that person steps back and begins valuing themselves enough to stop overextending their energy. A man who understands his worth eventually stops performing for recognition. He stops trying to constantly prove that he deserves respect, attention, or appreciation. Instead, he focuses on becoming stronger, wiser, and more independent. His confidence no longer depends on whether someone else notices his effort. Ironically, this is often when people begin to notice him the most, because the energy has changed. The man who, to try to hold everything together, is no longer chasing validation. He is moving forward with purpose, and that shift creates a powerful psychological effect. People start realizing that the effort they once took for granted was never guaranteed. It was a choice someone made every day, and when that choice is no longer being offered so freely, its true value finally becomes